Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for a New American Security, which released yesterday terrorist use of virtual currencies containing the potential threat, a fascinating new report. And we have two of the five authors of this report, Eli Maruyama, as well as Elizabeth Rosenberg. Guys, thanks very much for joining us. And this is your second to last day here at CNAS before you're going to IHS.
Yes, that's right. Thanks for having us.
Guys, thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
You guys have written a fascinating report, you're two of a five-person team, on terrorist financing and how terrorist organizations are using all sorts of novel new currencies like Bitcoin and other things to finance their operations. Elizabeth, I want to start with you. I mean, what are sort of the central findings of this report that you want everybody to know about?
Thanks. The takeaway message from this right up front is that terrorists are using virtual currencies now to fund some of their operations, but not at scale, not at large scale. So it's more episodic. It might be anecdotal, the reporting that we have. So the challenge right now is not to clamp down on something that is a massive, pernicious, and systemic threat, but rather to think about how best to make sure we're observing it and preventing it from becoming a really massive challenge in the counterterrorism sphere.
And Bitcoin being just one of the many different sorts of forms of financing that they're using. Ellie, tell us a little bit about how terrorist organizations, you guys have a fascinating chart in here that breaks down sort of the complexity, but how organizations are doing that. What are some of the techniques they're using to hide their money? Because the United States, after 9/11 in particular, became very, very focused on taking the financial war to terrorist organizations.
That's right. So as Liz discussed, we have seen episodic uses of virtual currencies by terrorist organizations. For instance, earlier this year, the Indonesian Financial Transactions Agency announced that Islamic militants in the Middle East use virtual currencies like Bitcoin to finance attacks in Indonesia. And there have been other instances. For example, a 17-year-old in Virginia was pled guilty to conspiring to provide material support to ISIS. He basically went on social media and provided instructions on the use of virtual currencies. So these are some cases that we've seen. But as Liz stated, it's episodic because so far terrorists have been able to rely on sort of the means that they have relied on previously to raise and move money, such as basically the use of cash or hawalas, which are informal money transfer systems, or basically transferring small amounts of money through the financial system, which can be masked amidst billions of dollars.
We were talking earlier, and I just mentioned that I said, since 9/11, but you mentioned actually since the founding of the Republic, the United States has been engaged in, talk to us a little bit about sort of throughout history, how the United States has sort of prosecuted this campaign.
Well, I would say the use of financial measures to through legal authorities to go after illicit finance or kinds of financing that present a political or security risk to the United States is certainly as old as the Republic. And there are instances, a big burst of its use during the Second World War when there was an effort to crack down on adversaries' financing as a corollary to the military force that was used at the time. And we've seen different models of the use of this financial coercion or economic statecraft since then. There are some examples people think of as having limited success, or they question their success. People commonly are referring to Cuba or the Iraq experience when they're talking about that, although and the use of sanctions, although we could also make a case for how there was utility to some of those measures. But since 9/11, there's been a different model used in the United States of primarily financial sanctions and also some other measures, trade control measures, the CFIUS process, for example, where U.S. Political authorities have looked to legal tools to try and prevent money from moving to terrorists, nuclear and weapons proliferators, narco-traffickers. And now in this context, well, in our report, we were looking at terrorist use of virtual currencies and asking the question, is there something unique about virtual currencies that makes it harder to track than other kinds of financial movement that Ellie was just referring to that terrorists have traditionally used?
and CFIUS being the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States that's overseen by the Treasury Department. I thought it was interesting when you were talking about World War II, because if you look at a lot of German companies that existed during the war, some of them were disbanded after the war, IG Farben being a good example about the horrors associated with the company being such that it led to the Allies voting them off the island, as it were, that they had to shut down their operations. How much money is involved? When we're talking about terrorist organizations, and even if it is something that's episodic, how much money is in their system that we need to work to interdict or to disrupt somehow?
I think it's useful to start by talking about how terrorists use money. So they can use money to finance specific attacks. For example, the 9/11 attacks are estimated to have cost somewhere between $400,000 to $500,000, whereas the November 2015 Paris attacks were estimated to have cost about $10,000. So the range can vary significantly. And for example, lone wolf terrorists who don't claim any associations with the larger terrorist group can quite easily carry out an attack on their own with quite limited financial resources. But if there's a larger terrorist organization that needs to support individuals with, for instance, dependents, and they need to provide for training and other living expenses, then the cost can run quite significant. So, for example, pre-9/11, Al-Qaeda's annual budget was estimated to have been about $30 million, and ISIS, which a U.S. government official noted was one of the most well-funded terrorist organizations, had an annual budget of about $2 billion in 2015.
That's an extraordinary sum of money for the organization. But what are ways that the U.S. can interdict those funds, right? How do you get to attacking, finding it, right? I mean, right now this is based on an estimate, finding it, attacking it, and then stopping it.
Well, there's a variety of ways. People may be familiar with the instances in the fight against ISIS where literally planes have dropped bombs on cash houses. So that's one very specific physical way to destroy money available to the organization. Also, engaging in activities that will cut off their ability to earn revenue. So where, again, taking ISIS for example, they have engaged in the sales and refining of some petroleum or petroleum products, bombing or destroying some of those refineries. They're pretty primitive as refineries go, but destroying them, or the caravans of trucks that are transporting those to a consumer population is another way to destroy the product, to deprive the group of its revenue. There are also ways to go after the money flow once it's moved into the financial system, so between banks or money exchangers or that sort of thing. And that looks like, in the United States, for example, if the Treasury Department names a number of entities, sanctions them, puts it on its sanctions blacklist, the SDN list, then every bank in U.S. jurisdiction and any other covered entity, regulated entity, money services businesses like Western Union and others have an obligation to make sure that they're checking every transaction, every client, and so that they're not facilitating money movement for those people. And that will freeze and lock down and prevent an ability of moving money for those terrorists and terrorist groups. However, it's tricky when these terrorists are using aliases, as they often do, or front companies, as they often do, and it's certainly a practice in organized criminal activity or narco-trafficking, for example, proliferation networks. So the challenge for financial institutions and any other regulated entity is to make sure they're doing enough due diligence to know who is behind the transaction to try and prevent that from moving through the formal financial system.
But it's something that's doable, right? Banco Delta Asia, the United States targeted, focused, and that's what brought Pyongyang back to the six-party talks. I mean, subsequently that didn't work out that well, but we had to break U.S. law to return, I think it was $10 million back to China or Russia. I can't remember which one of the two it was. What are some of the recommendations that you guys have? Hold on, let me put your report back together again. What are some of the recommendations you guys have from an international community standpoint? Because this is a long fight, right? The kinetic piece of it may end relatively soon, but there's an ideological piece to this. There is an economic piece to this. There's obviously a banking piece to this, a financial piece of it. What is the international standard that's necessary to wage over protracted periods of time the economic battle? Because once ISIS is dealt with, there's going to be somebody else who's going to surface, right? I mean, this is a hydra, so each head bears a couple of extra heads from it, each one you cut off. What's the kind of international standard that's necessary? And what are some of the things that Washington has to do to either lead that process or to be part of that process?
Well, I'll start here. There's a couple of things to bear in mind here. First would be that I think it's both an issue of capacity and of will. And it's certainly not a task for the United States only. So the United States, while it has a massive financial system and any medium to large size company or bank in the world will touch the U.S. financial system, so by virtue of that, the United States has quite a broad jurisdictional reach. Nevertheless, it really falls on the United States and all kinds of other actors, other national governments, the financial regulators, the law enforcement and criminal prosecution elements of all kinds of other governments to look for this activity and to crack down on it. And one of the things that makes it challenging to go after this for the use of virtual currency by terrorists is that there's a couple of features about virtual currency that makes it hard to track. It's anonymity or semi-anonymity. Also, it's globally dispersed and it moves very quickly. So it would be possible for a sophisticated terrorist actor to use this system to move money quickly with a lot of anonymity and protection. And it may come down to, if you will, a battle of the computing power on the part of the terrorists. Can they stay ahead of the investigators and the forensic investigators who are looking at what terrorists are behind the use of a certain kind of cryptocurrency, virtual currency, in order to try and decode who it is and what their network looks like. So in order to understand that, U.S. authorities have to partner with counterparts everywhere else in the world so that they understand when a transaction may be bounced from one jurisdiction to another one, and to gather information about terrorist networks to try and overlay that with the financial information to get a picture of who's behind this and what's going on.
Ellie?
I think the role of the private sector, namely banks and financial institutions, is very key to trying to tackle terrorist financing as a global problem. For instance, making sure that there's a clear alignment and prioritizing terrorist financing as an illicit financing risk between government and financial sector is very important because financial banks, for example, are entrusted with basically making sure to detect a lot of illicit transactions, not just terrorist finance, but proliferation finance, as Liz was saying, or just monitoring for customers' accounts for any fraudulent transactions, for example. So they're entrusted to do a lot, and in some cases they may have very limited resources to establish compliance systems that are rigorous compliance systems. So making sure that there's a clear prioritization of terrorist finance between the government and private sector is very important.
Ellie Maruyama, thank you very much. Elizabeth Rosenberg, thank you very much. Part of the team that brought to you terrorist use of virtual currencies containing the potential threat. It's on the CNAS website. Guys, thanks very much, and best of luck on the new IHS gig.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good to talk to you.